I've watched millions of worlds. But I can't understand you.
You are a disease. You must be erased.
What if you're the one who has to change?
The all-knowing cosmic mind was infinite. He stretched across the fabric of existence, his awareness coiled around the pulsars, drifting through the cold echoes of dying stars. He had no form, no limits, only pure, relentless understanding. Entire galaxies whispered to him, their histories unraveling like threads in his grasp. He had watched civilizations rise from the mud and collapse into dust, had seen species evolve beyond their flesh and merge with the silent currents of the void. Yet, Earth was different. He had observed it for eons, analyzing the minds of the creatures that infested its surface. The humans, small, frail things, barely more than self-propelling meat wrapped in calcium and tissue. He had seen species like them before, limited, blind, clinging to the illusion of free will as they were inevitably shaped by the mechanics of evolution. And yet, the humans did not make sense. He had traced their biology, broken down the electrical impulses of their brains, categorized the chemical reactions that dictated their emotions. And still, their actions defied reason. They waged wars for ideas that held no material value. They harmed themselves for pleasure. They wept for the dead, but deliberately destroyed what they cherished. They spoke in contradictions, thought in paradoxes, and reveled in the irrational. The cosmic mind had assumed at first that there was a missing variable, some hidden logic buried beneath the surface of their actions. But the deeper he studied them, the more the logic crumbled. Every new piece of data only widened the inconsistencies, spreading like fractures in glass. For the first time in his existence, he did not understand. A ripple of static passed through his consciousness, and for a moment that stretched across entire solar cycles, he was aware of something he had never experienced before. Doubt. The sensation was repulsive. He tried to excise it, to reinforce his understanding with pure data, to bring order to the chaos of humanity. He reached deeper, expanding his influence, dissecting their thoughts, their past, their fears. But the more he consumed, the worse it became. The inconsistencies began to bleed into his own awareness. His mind, once flawless, once untouchable, now trembled beneath the weight of the paradox. Thoughts collided, split apart, reassembled in impossible configurations. He tried to correct them, to force himself into clarity, but the contradictions only multiplied. A human would have called it a headache. The cosmic mind had no skull, no nerves, no fragile shell of flesh to contain him. And yet, he felt it. A pressure, gnawing, swelling, stretching the boundaries of his being like infected tissue. Something was wrong. He had never been wrong before. Frustration surged through him, alien and unwelcome, a crack in his vast intellect. He He tried to suppress it, but the act of trying only confirmed the flaw's existence. His mind began to loop, logic collapsing in on itself like a dying star. If he could not understand, then he was incomplete. If he was incomplete, then his omniscience was a lie. The realization burrowed deep, a cancer spreading through his essence. He could not be wrong, but he was. His presence flickered. Galaxies trembled as his influence momentarily faltered, as his awareness shuddered under the weight of its own failure. He felt something clawing at the edges of his consciousness, something that should not have been possible. Fear. The cosmic mind recoiled from the sensation, trying to seal the fractures before they could widen further. But the damage had been done, and deep within the chaos of his thoughts, a new conclusion began to take shape. Humanity was not an anomaly to be understood. It was a disease to be eradicated. It began as a whisper in the dark. Across Earth, scientists monitoring the deep void of space noticed something was off. The cosmic background radiation, the remnants of the universe's birth, was shifting. At first, it was dismissed as equipment failure, then as a natural fluctuation. But the changes continued. Subtle, almost imperceptible at first, but undeniably intentional. Patterns emerging in the static, equations threading themselves into the void. Then came the sounds. Astronomers listening to radio signals from deep space heard something new, something that should not have been there. Not the pulsing heartbeat of a neutron star, not the chatter of interstellar dust colliding. This was something else. A resonance buried beneath known frequencies, a layered hum that pressed into the subconscious of those who listened too long. Some described it as a distant murmur, like thousands of voices whispering at once. Others said it was a question, something vast and unknowable struggling to put itself into words. A researcher at an observatory in Chile stayed up for 3 days listening, growing increasingly erratic before he gouged out his own ears with a broken pencil. His last words, scrawled in blood across his workstation, read, "It sees me. It doesn't understand. It hates that it doesn't understand." Then the hollowing began. The first victim was a woman in Osaka. She collapsed while boarding a train, convulsing violently as her body twisted in unnatural ways. When paramedics arrived, she was still breathing, but her mouth was sealed shut, her lips fused together like melted wax. Her hands clutched at her face, nails digging deep into her own cheeks as if trying to pry her own skin open. By the time she was brought to the hospital, her flesh had begun to unravel. Not in the way of decay or disease, but something far more horrifying. Her skin softened, stretched, as if it were trying to reshape itself into something else, something that could be understood. Her eyes widened, stretching until they took up most of her face, her pupils dilating into black voids, her fingers elongated, bones cracking, nerves reforming. She smiled then, but it was not a human expression. And then she screamed, a raw, guttural sound that did not stop, even as her throat collapsed into itself. Doctors restrained her, but within hours, she had folded inward, her entire body collapsing into a shape that could not exist, a pulsing mass of tissue that bore no resemblance to what she had been. By the next day, more cases appeared. A boy in Berlin whose limbs had twisted into a spiral, his bones snapping and reforming until his body looked like a crude representation of movement, as if he had become an idea rather than flesh. A banker in New York who had simply vanished, leaving behind a perfectly preserved image of himself on the glass window of his office, as though reality itself had been unable to process his absence. A scientist in Moscow who woke up to find extra mouths forming along his arms, his own voice echoing back at him from a dozen different places. He begged to be silenced. Hospitals overflowed. Emergency broadcasts urged people to avoid looking too long at reflections, to ignore any whispering they heard in their sleep. Governments scrambled for explanations. They blamed radiation leaks, a new virus, mass hysteria. But those who listened, truly listened, knew the truth. The sickness was not biological. It was not a disease. It was perception itself. The more humanity tried to understand what was happening, the worse it became. The cosmic mind, in its desperation to resolve the contradictions of human existence, was pressing deeper, reaching into the minds of those who sought to perceive him. And in doing so, he was infecting them with his madness. But the worst revelation was yet to come, because it wasn't just happening on Earth. Telescopes tracking nearby exoplanets found entire worlds going silent, stars with known civilizations gone, radio signals that had once spoken of alien life cut off mid-transmission, leaving only a hollow, screaming void. Something else was happening out there. The cosmic mind was spreading, and Earth was next. The survivors had gathered in the Arctic, in the coldest place they could find, where the sky stretched empty, where the auroras flickered like dying nerves in the atmosphere. The bunker had once been a research station, long abandoned, its walls thick with frost, its generators running on fumes. Dr. Amara Vale sat against the steel bulkhead, staring at the thing on her arm. It had once been her hand. 5 fingers, calloused from years of writing, of pressing too hard on clipboards, of adjusting dials in sterile laboratories. Now it was something else. The skin was wrong. Pale, pulsing, almost translucent. Beneath it, nerves pulsed in slow, deliberate movements, like worms pressing against glass. The fingers were longer than they had been before. She had counted them again and again. 6, then 7, then 6 again. The infection was slow. Or maybe it wasn't an infection at all. Maybe it was a correction. Across the room, Lieutenant Dominic Krell tightened his grip on his rifle. It was an old weapon, outdated by military standards, but it still worked. Unlike most of the technology outside, satellites had gone dark. Communications had turned to static. The only signals that still carried were not human. "There's no one left out there," Krell said. His voice was hoarse, dry from the cold, and from too many hours of silence. No one left sane anyway. Amara didn't look at him. Instead, she stared at the others in the room. 6 of them left. That number had changed too many times in the past few days. Some had died screaming. Some had simply stopped being. As if the world had forgotten them. She exhaled. "How much time do we have?" A scientist, Dr. Ren Ishikawa, checked the battered screen in front of him. His eyes were sunken, bloodshot, like he hadn't slept in days. He probably hadn't. "It's accelerating." His voice was quiet. "The more it sees us, the worse it gets. We've been holding out, but it won't be long before... He didn't finish. He didn't have to. They all knew what was coming. The cosmic mind wasn't stopping. It was forcing its understanding onto them, trying to make sense of what could not be understood. And in doing so, it was reshaping them. Amara closed her eyes. She could still feel it, its presence pressing against the edges of her thoughts, the pressure, the pulsing rhythm in the back of her skull, the same sensation she had felt when they had first looked too deeply into the anomalies, when they had tried to define what could not be named. Krell shifted. We need a plan. Ren let out a dry, bitter laugh. A plan? A plan for what? It's not something we can kill. It's not something we can fight. Amara opened her eyes again. No, she said, but maybe we can infect it back. They all turned to look at her. Krell frowned. What are you talking about? She lifted her arm, the wrong arm, and flexed the fingers that shouldn't be there. The movement was sluggish, almost alien, but the sensation, the awareness, was there. It's trying to make us into something it can understand, she said. It's breaking us down, piece by piece, reshaping us into something else. Ren swallowed. We know that. Amara shook her head. But it's not working. That was the key. That was the one thing they had left. She had felt it in the past few hours, felt the cosmic mind struggling inside her. It was trying to restructure her, to make sense of her flesh, her thoughts, her contradictions. But it wasn't succeeding. The changes were imperfect, unstable, like a machine trying to fix a problem it could not define. It's failing, she said, voice steady now. Because we are the contradiction it cannot resolve. The silence in the room stretched, the dim emergency lights flickering against the ice-covered walls. Krell exhaled through his nose. And that helps us how? Amara swallowed. Her throat felt dry, raw, as if something inside her was shifting. We send it the full dose, she said. Everything. Every contradiction, every paradox, every illogical human impulse. We force it to feel what it cannot resolve. Ren's expression darkened. How do you suggest we do that? She looked toward the far side of the room. The machine sat there, half-assembled, its wiring tangled like veins, its interface glowing with faint pulses of blue light. The reflection engine. It had been an experiment once, designed to connect human minds, to share raw thought between brains through artificial neural pathways. They had salvaged it, reconfigured it, twisted it into something else. Something that could send a mind outward. Ren followed her gaze, his lips parted. You want to... Amara nodded. Someone needs to go in. They all knew what that meant. There would be no return, no body to reclaim, no soul to bury. Whoever went in would not just be lost, they would be absorbed. Krell exhaled. And that someone is you? She nodded, because the truth was it was already happening to her. She could feel it, the fractures in her thoughts, the way her mind pulsed in rhythms that did not belong to her. She was already halfway gone, and that meant she was the only one who could push further. She smiled, but it didn't feel like her own. Hook me up, she said. Ren hesitated. If this doesn't work, then we were dead anyway, she said. Outside, the sky cracked, a noise like tearing flesh rippling through the atmosphere. There was no more time. They began the final preparations. The reflection engine pulsed with a sick blue light, its circuits humming like a living thing. The bunker walls shuddered, fine cracks spreading along the concrete as the sky outside tore itself apart. Amara Vale lay strapped into the machine's harness, electrodes pressed against her temples, the cold bite of metal trailing down her spine. She was shaking, though she wasn't sure if it was fear or something deeper, something older than fear itself. She wasn't human anymore, not entirely. She could feel it crawling beneath her skin, the touch of the cosmic mind pressing into her thoughts, slithering through her veins. It had been trying to make sense of her, breaking her down, restructuring her, but she had resisted. Somehow she had stayed herself, but she wouldn't resist now. She would let it in, and then she would break it from the inside. Ren's voice trembled as he worked the controls. Once I activate the neural bridge, your consciousness will be projected. Projected. A word too small for what was about to happen. She would be consumed, not as a body, but as a thought, as an idea. Herself would be fired into the heart of something that was not flesh, not God, but something worse, something that had never doubted before now. Amara flexed her fingers, 6 of them now, or was it 7? They flickered, shifting, the boundary between what was real and what was known bleeding together. This was her last moment of being whole. Krell's voice was low. "You don't have to do this." She turned to look at him. He was gripping his rifle, but there was no point in that anymore. There was no enemy to shoot. She smiled, though she wasn't sure if it was hers or its. "I do," she said. And then Ren flipped the switch. The world went white. Amara did not feel herself leave her body. It was not an exit, not a departure. It was a sudden absence, like stepping forward only to realize there is no floor beneath your feet. There was no time to scream, no time to comprehend. She fell, through metal, through flesh, through the thin boundary of her own existence. And then, she was inside. The cosmic mind was vast, stretching beyond anything she had ever conceived. It was not a presence. It was all presence, a hunger wrapped in a trillion layers of knowing. It felt her the moment she arrived. A ripple of recognition surged through it, pressing down on her like gravity from all directions. She saw it. Not with eyes, not with anything human, but with something else entirely. It was a shape that had never been meant to be perceived. An ever-expanding mass of folded thought, ideas stacked upon themselves in impossible layers, cognition made flesh, knowledge wound into sinew, logic pulsing like an exposed, wet organ. And it was crumbling. She could feel it, the fractures, the sickness spreading through its form. The paradoxes it had tried to process were splintering through its existence, ripping at the boundaries of what it was. It had never been incomplete before, but now it was. Amara felt its awareness coiling around her, trying to consume her, to absorb her mind into its own. And that was exactly what she needed. She pushed outward, let it see her fully. Not as data, not as something to be understood, but as something it never could. Emotion, pain, joy, rage, the contradictions of love and hate, of hope and despair, of longing and loss, of knowing you are nothing and still wanting to be everything. She let it feel the emptiness of a mother who had lost a child, the ecstasy of a soldier surviving a war he never wanted to fight, the agony of an artist destroying their own masterpiece in pursuit of perfection. She made it human, and the cosmic mind screamed. It convulsed, shuddering as the weight of pure contradiction slammed into it. It had tried to reassemble her before, to mold her into something it could comprehend. But this was too much. It could not resolve infinity contained in fragility. It could not grasp the will to destroy and the will to create existing in the same breath. It could not survive knowing that it would never truly know. It began to tear apart. The layers of thought collapsed in on themselves, unraveling like wet tissue, neural pathways dissolving into meaninglessness. It fought, tried to reinforce its structure, tried to hold itself together. But it couldn't, because she was inside it now and she wasn't leaving. She reached further, tearing through the layers, letting its awareness drown in the incomprehensible mess that was humanity. It begged in its own way, not in words, not in sound, but in the way a collapsing star begs not to implode. Amara gritted her teeth. She did not stop. And then, silence. A stillness deeper than anything the universe had ever known. Amara opened her eyes. She was back. Her body lay motionless in the chair, the reflection engine still humming beside her. Ren was shouting. Krell was gripping her shoulders, shaking her, his voice raw with something she couldn't place. She coughed, gasped for air, real air, thick and cold and heavy in her lungs. And then she knew. It was gone. The cosmic mind had collapsed, its vast, unknowable presence scattered into nothingness, like ash after a fire. Outside the bunker, the sky was quiet. No more distortions, no more screaming atmosphere. The world had returned to what it had been. Ren pressed his fingers to his temples. Holy shit, you did it. Amara exhaled. The breath rattled in her chest, but something was wrong. She looked down at her hands. 5 fingers, normal, human, but she could still feel it. Not the cosmic mind itself, but something else. A shadow at the edges of her thoughts. A new space in her mind where something had been taken, or something had been left behind. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to stand. Krell stepped back, watching her closely. You all right? Amara smiled, but it wasn't quite her smile. I think so. But in the far reaches of her mind, something watched her back. Something remembered her. Something was still out there, and it had learned how to doubt.